Be warned, this episode is especially nasally because allergies are currently wreaking havoc on my entire existence. Combine that with the chaos of daily life and, well, we're running on spooky vibes and sheer willpower. But hey, I've got a job to do, and you all out there still need your scary stories. Today, we're diving into some chilling tales from the Appalachian region, stories of monsters, creatures, and eerie encounters that'll have you checking over your shoulder every 5 seconds. So grab a blanket, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself, because this is Unexplained Encounters. Also, quick thought, how would you feel about episodes told more like case files? Instead of, I saw something in the woods, it'd be more like, in 2069, a lone hiker reported a disturbing figure in the mist. Just something I've been toying with. Let me know what you think. All right, let's get into it. Story 1. Samantha C. I grew up in a small hollow in the Appalachian Mountains. Our house was at the end of a dirt road that always turned to mud when it rained, with dense forest right behind it. My mother left when I was only 4 years old. I barely remember her, and I never knew my dad. His name wasn't even on the birth certificate. My grandparents didn't have much money either, but they are the ones that raised me. Grandpa worked in the coal mines until he got sick, then did whatever odd jobs he could find after that. Grandma grew vegetables in her garden and canned food for winter. We survived on Grandpa's disability checks and whatever animals he could hunt. One of my earliest memories is sitting on my grandpa's knee. We were by the wood stove, and he would tell stories. He had dozens of stories, tales about the Cherokee who lived in these mountains before the white settlers came, stories about feuds between families that stretched back generations, legends about creatures that lived deep in the hollows where people rarely went, and for good reason. His favorite of all these stories was the story of the Appalachian howler. The howler, he'd say his voice would drop low every time he said, it is older than these mountains, been here since before people, and it'll be here long after we're gone. Then he would describe it something between a bear and a wolf, he said, but larger than either, with a scream that could freeze your blood cold, according to Grandpa. The howler only came out on nights, when the moon was new and the sky was at its darkest. You'll know by its call, he'd say. Not like any natural thing you've ever heard. If you're ever outside at night and you hear the howler, you listen close. As long as it's howling, you're safe. But when the howling stops here, he would always pause, making sure my eyes were wide. If the howling stops, it means it's found you as a kid. I loved that story, sent shivers down my spine in the best way, like a good ghost story around a campfire. But there was something odd about the way Grandpa told it, something in his eyes that didn't always match the playful tone in his voice, and I noticed early on that both my grandparents acted differently when the moon was gone from the sky. They were careful people by nature, had to be living so far out with no close neighbors, and suddenly having a little girl to look after. But on new moon nights, swear they were downright skittish. Grandma would check the locks 2 or 3 times. Grandpa would bring in extra firewood, more than we'd need for the night. And they were strict about me being inside before sunset on those nights. Not just inside though, but doors locked, curtains drawn, no sense taking chances. Grandma would say if I complained, that was always her answer when I asked why no sense taking chances. I was 8 years old the first time I heard the howler myself. It was late October, just before Halloween. Perfect. The nights were getting longer, and there was a bite in the air that meant winter wasn't far behind. I'd been in bed for about an hour, not quite asleep yet, just watching the shadows from my nightlight dance across the ceiling. At first I thought it was the wind. We got pretty fierce winds in the fall, sometimes the kind that found every crack in our old house and moaned through them like a ghost. But this started low, almost too quiet to hear, then built up until it seemed to fill up the whole night. It wasn't like a wolf or coyote howl, so if that's what you're imagining, get it right out of your head. Those sounds I knew from living in the mountains, but this was very, very different. It was rough and like something with damaged vocal cords trying to make noise. The sound went up and down in a pattern that almost seemed like words that I couldn't understand. The sound sent goosebumps racing across my skin, and I was up and out of that bed before I even realized. I'd moved running for my grandparents' room. I found them both already awake. Grandma was sitting on the edge of her bed pulling on her robe. Grandpa was at the window peering out through a crack in the curtains. "Hush," Grandma said the moment I came around the corner, before I had a chance to open my mouth. She held out her arms and I ran into them, burying my face against her shoulder. "Is that?" I started to ask. "Don't you worry about it," she said, smoothing my hair. "Everything's going to be fine." but I could feel how tense she was, and when I looked up at Grandpa, I saw something I'd never seen on his face before. He was scared. He stepped away from the window and knelt down in front of me, putting his hands on my shoulders. "I'm going to go sit in the living room for a spell," he said. "You stay here with Grandma, you hear?" I nodded, and he kissed the top of my head before leaving the room. A minute later, he was back with his shotgun, the old double barrel that normally hung over the fireplace, something I thought was more of a decoration than a weapon. Most days, it wasn't the gun he hunted with. Grandma kept me in their bedroom, and we spent the night in there. She read stories and we played Yahtzee while the howling went on outside. Bless her heart, she tried her best to act normal for me, tried to pretend we were just having a fun night, but she kept glancing at the window and she jumped every time the howling got particularly loud. I remember thinking that it didn't sound like it was coming from any one place. Sometimes it sounded close, right outside the walls. Even other times it sounded distant, far up on the ridge, but it never fully stopped, not until the sky began to lighten up with the first hint of dawn. The next morning, Grandpa was asleep in his armchair, shotgun across his lap. Grandma made pancakes for breakfast, like it was a special occasion, and neither of them mentioned the sounds from the night before. When I tried to bring it up, Grandma just said, "Dear, some things we don't need to talk about in the light of day." After that, I always paid attention to the phases of the moon, always knew when the new moon was coming, and I always made sure I was inside before dark. On those nights, fast forward several years, I was 13 years old. Awkwardly, between child and teenager, Grandpa had passed away 2 years earlier. A stroke took him. Sorry if I get this wrong, but I think some sort of insurance claim or life insurance thing from the old mining job gave Grandma just enough money to pay off the house. And from there on, she was getting Social Security and using what little savings she had to live on since Grandpa's passing. We didn't hear the howler, hadn't even talked about it. Part of me was starting to think it was just a story after all, something to keep me from wandering too far into the woods at night. The rational part of my brain said those howls had probably been some animal, a mountain lion, maybe could have been a bear, and Grandpa's stories had just made them seem more mysterious than they were. It was spring break, mid-April, my friend. Tammy was staying over for the weekend. Tammy lived in town, and one of those cookie-cutter houses with neighbors close enough to borrow sugar without leaving your yard. She loved coming out to our place. Said it felt like a real adventure. We'd spent the day exploring the woods behind our house. We were deep in conversation about Dylan, a guy in class who we both had a massive crush on. Tammy was convinced he liked me. I was sure he was into her, though, and we went back and forth debating about stuff like that for hours. It wasn't until I noticed the light changing, the shadows getting longer, that I realized how late it had gotten. We should head back," I said, standing up and brushing dirt off my jeans. Tammy looked up, squinting at the sky, visible through the tree canopy. "That's not that late, sun's still up," she said. "Yeah, but it'll be dark by the time we get home if we don't go now." She rolled her eyes but got up anyway, and we started back along the creek. We walked slowly, still caught up in our conversation about Dylan and whether his new haircut made him look more like Leonardo DiCaprio or not. We were maybe halfway back to the house by then when I heard a sound that I hadn't heard in about 5 years, a sound I recognized instantly, low and growly at first, then rising into something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stopped right in my tracks. My pulse raced. "Oh, what's wrong?" Tammy asked. The howling came again. I remember the way she cocked her head around, listening to it. "What is that?" "Sounds like a big cat, Tammy." "We need to run," I said, and I grabbed her by the arm, like right now we need to get back to the house. Tammy laughed and shook my hand away. "Are you serious? It's just some animal, probably a cougar in heat." "That's not a cougar," I explained, but even as the words left my mouth, I started to feel a flicker of doubt. Maybe it was just a mountain lion, maybe Grandpa's stories and my own childhood fears had turned a normal animal sound into something supernatural. The howling came once more. It was getting closer, and Tammy raised an eyebrow. "See, just some horny cat," she said, and the way she said that, so confident, so dismissive, it made me feel stupid for being scared. "Yeah, maybe," I said, relaxing a little, "but still, we should get back. Grandma will be wondering where we are." We started to walk again, faster than before, but still not running. Part of me was still listening to the sound, trying to compare it to the memory I had. Was it really the same, or had I just built it up in my mind over years? We were nearing the edge of the woods, maybe a 4-mile from home. When the howling stopped, I felt that silence, like it was actual weight on my back at the same time. The woods got quiet, just complete silence, where there should have been noise. "Tammy," I said quietly, "we need to run now." She must have heard something in my voice, because this time she wasn't arguing. We started to jog along the path, the fading light making it harder to see where we were. Putting our feet, we'd gone about 50 yards when something landed on the ground behind us with a thud heavy enough to vibrate my bones. We froze then, slowly turned around. The path behind us was dark. The trees overhead blotted out what little light was left in the sky, but I could hear something breathing deep and heavy, breathing. "Run," I whispered. And this time Tammy didn't need any convincing. We tore down that path. I could hear something behind us moving faster than any person could run, and I knew we were in trouble. In moments we burst out of the tree line, and I could see my house in the distance, a warm yellow light glowing. In the kitchen window, as we broke from the cover of the trees, a sound like a gunshot split the air. A bit of bark burst from a tree, not 3 feet from where we stood. I screamed, thinking for a wild second that whatever was chasing us had some kind of weapon. But then I saw Grandma standing in the yard. She was holding and pointing Grandpa's shotgun. "Run," she was screaming to the house. Now we ran like our lives depended on it, because in that moment, I truly believed they did. We made it to the porch and Grandma was there, grabbing us and shoving us through the door. Then she slammed it behind us and threw the deadbolt. "What were you thinking?" she demanded. I can remember how pale her face was. Her hands were shaking as she leaned the shotgun against the wall, being out this late tonight of all nights. I'm sorry, I gasped. I was trying to catch my breath. We lost track of time. I didn't realize it was a new moon. Grandma closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath. When she opened them again, she looked calmer. "You're safe now. That's what matters." Tammy was looking between us, confused and still scared. "What's going on?" "What was that?" Grandma looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "Come with me. Let's go sit somewhere more comfortable. I'll make some hot chocolate and we can talk." We ended up in Grandma's bedroom, just like that night years ago. Soon she brought in hot chocolate and cookies, and we were sitting on her bed while she took the rocking chair. "What your grandpa used to tell you about the howler?" she said. Looking at me, it wasn't a story. "I know," I said quietly. "What howler?" Tammy asked. So I told her the story from memory, the way Grandpa had told it to me all those years ago, about how it only came out on the darkest nights, how it howl was a warning, and how silence meant danger. "That's what was out there?" Tammy asked when I finished. "That's what was chasing us?" Grandma nodded. "I've lived in these mountains my whole life, and I've only seen it twice, once when I was about your age, and again tonight. You saw it tonight?" I asked. "Just a glimpse," she said. "When you girls came out of the trees, I saw something right behind you. It was big, covered in hair, moving in a way that no natural critter moves." She shook her head, explaining that she'd fired a shot at it but missed, and how she was so panicked and worried for a split moment that she may have shot us, but luckily hadn't. But it did seem to scare the thing off. Within the hour, the howling had started up again, distant at first, then moving around the perimeter of our property like it was pacing. We stayed up late into the night, playing Yahtzee, of course, and talking, trying to pretend. Story 2. We weren't really paying attention to the sound that night. At first it was just a low, almost imperceptible noise, like something you would barely notice unless you were tuned in. But the sound grew louder over time, and by the early morning hours, I realized we were no longer hearing the usual forest sounds we were used to. The next morning came with its own quiet tension. Tammy's parents arrived as planned to pick her up, and I stood there nervously, watching her load her overnight bag into the back of their car. Deep down, I feared she wouldn't want to come back. After all, what we had experienced the night before was nothing short of terrifying. But to my surprise, as Tammy was about to hop into the car, she turned and leaned in close to me. She whispered with a grin, "That was the most exciting sleepover ever. Wait till I tell everyone at school." I let out a small sigh of relief, but I couldn't help but warn her, "Don't. They'll think we're crazy." Her eyes sparkled with mischief. "It'll be our secret then. Besides, I definitely want to come back. Maybe not on a new moon, but I'll come back." Her tone was playful, but there was something in her eyes that made me wonder just how much of the night she understood. After that experience, my grandmother implemented a new rule at the house. No one was allowed to go outside after 9 p.m. on new moon days. No exceptions. I didn't dare question it, not after what we had witnessed. Even now, years later, I still find myself checking the phases of the moon before making plans. Old habits die hard. I guess, better to be safe than sorry, especially in the woods. I went on to get a job in the city after high school and only found my way back home for short visits. Every time I drove up that winding road to the house where I grew up, I couldn't help but keep a sharp eye on the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. I didn't care if it was day or night. I kept a close watch on every shadow. The past had a strange way of lingering, especially when you've seen things that can't be easily explained. A few years later, my wife and I began hunting together. We were both from rural Virginia, and hunting had always been a part of life for us. Every fall we would take a week off work and head into the Appalachian mountains for deer season. It was our little escape, just us, the woods, and the quiet peace that came with it. We had a small cabin that we rented from a man named Earl. I think Earl liked us, especially since he charged us practically nothing, so long as we returned with some venison jerky the following year. It was a good deal. Earl was a great guy, quiet, old school, and with a lot of stories to tell. Over the years, we had plenty of successful hunting trips, but there were two in particular that I still can't explain. They happened a few years apart, but I still think about them all the time. The first strange encounter took place in November. My wife and I had been at the cabin for days, and we hadn't seen a decent buck yet. It was a bit frustrating, but that's how hunting went sometimes. On the fourth morning, we decided to try a new spot, about a mile north of our usual hunting grounds. This area was different. The trees were older, and the undergrowth thicker, but it felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. We'd been in our blind for a few hours, just after sunrise, when something changed in the air. It's hard to describe, but if you've ever spent time in the woods, you know what I mean. The temperature seemed to drop by 10 degrees in an instant, and there was this palpable pressure, like something was brewing, like a storm was about to break. I looked over at my wife and saw the same concern on her face. She felt it too. I asked her if she thought we should pack up, and without saying a word, she nodded. As we were getting ready, though, we heard a sound unlike anything I had ever heard in those woods before. It wasn't the sound of a deer or a bear or even a bobcat. No, this sound was high-pitched, like metal grinding against metal, and it echoed sharply through the trees. My wife grabbed my arm and pointed to the ridge about 100 yards away. There, moving through the tree line, we saw something that froze us in place. I thought it was a person at first because it was walking upright on two legs, but the way it moved, it didn't make sense. It was robotic, stiff, and too fast for someone navigating such rough terrain. For a few long seconds we stood there, eyes locked on the figure. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it disappeared behind the ridge. It was big, much bigger than any man I'd ever seen, and the wings, those wings, they were large, leathery, and seemed to span nearly 10 feet. They weren't feathered, not like a bird, but more like the wings of a bat. The creature's body was dark, either black or deep green, but the shadows made it hard to tell for sure. We didn't stick around to investigate further. We grabbed our things and hurried back to the cabin, though we didn't run. We didn't want to draw attention to ourselves, but as we walked, we could hear that metallic screeching noise again, now coming from a different direction, as though the thing was circling us. My heart raced. When we made it back to the cabin, we were both quiet, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. I suggested it was probably just a large bird of prey, maybe an eagle that looked bigger because of the angle or the lighting. My wife suggested it might have been a hang glider, though we both knew there were no launch sites nearby, but none of it made sense. That night, Earl stopped by to drop off some firewood. My wife casually mentioned what we had seen, trying to keep it light-hearted. Earl went unusually quiet, his face hardening. He asked us where we had seen the creature, and when we told him, he seemed almost worried. "That's an area that's had its share of strange sightings for over 100 years, Earl said softly. Local folks call it the snallygaster. It's part bird, part reptile, sometimes with tentacles, and sometimes it's got metallic parts. It's been described as making that screeching sound you heard." I thought Earl was just messing with us, telling us an old local legend. But when he described the sound, exactly what we had heard, I felt a chill run through me. It was too close to what we had experienced. Earl warned us to stay away from that part of the woods, especially at dawn and dusk, and he seemed genuinely concerned. We didn't see anything else that trip, and we avoided the northern part of the woods for the rest of the season. Eventually, we convinced ourselves that it was just a large bird, or maybe it was a combination of stress and poor visibility that made the encounter seem worse than it was. But in the back of my mind, I knew something wasn't right. Years passed, and we continued going back to the same woods for hunting trips, but we avoided the northern areas. We didn't talk much about that strange encounter. It was one of those weird things that couldn't be easily explained, but you didn't dwell on, and then came another November. It was the last day of our trip, and we'd had a good season, 2 big bucks between us. We decided to head out early in the morning, hoping to catch one last deer before heading home. We went to a spot about a mile east of the cabin, an area we knew well. The morning was foggy, and visibility was maybe 30 yards at most. We'd been in our blind for about an hour when we heard rustling from a thicket 30 yards ahead. I raised my rifle, expecting to see a deer, but what stepped out wasn't a deer at all. It was roughly the size of a black bear, but there was something wrong about it. It had a long neck, and its head looked like a beak. Not a bird's beak, but something harder, metallic almost, reflecting the little sunlight that cut through the fog. Its body was heavy, thick and powerful. Its legs were like a reptile's, not a mammal's. But what really made my stomach turn were the tentacles. 6 thick, writhing tendrils that extended from its shoulders, moving like they were tasting the air. My wife and I froze. We didn't speak. We didn't even breathe. The creature was scanning the ground as if it were looking for something. We stayed perfectly still, praying it wouldn't see us. After what felt like an eternity, the creature made that same grinding metallic sound we had heard years ago, but it was softer now, almost as though it was murmuring to itself. Then, without warning, it looked up sharply, directly toward our blind. It couldn't have seen us. We were well hidden and downwind, but for some reason, it seemed to sense something. My wife, shaking with fear, slowly raised her phone to try to snap a picture. But in that split second, the creature reared up onto its hind legs, standing nearly 10 feet tall. Its wings unfurled, leathery and ribbed, like the wings of a bat or even a dragon from a movie. It screeched again, so loud it hurt my ears, before lunging forward, not toward us, but parallel to our position. It moved with incredible speed, gliding across the ground rather than running. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it disappeared into the fog. We sat there in stunned silence for what felt like forever, before we finally decided to make our way back to the cabin. We kept scanning the trees and the sky, but we didn't see it again. Back at the cabin, my wife checked her phone, hoping she'd managed to take a picture, but she hadn't. She was so scared. She probably didn't even remember hitting the button. We packed up and left early, not even waiting to say goodbye to Earl. On the drive home, we finally talked about what we had seen. It was impossible to ignore it anymore. The creature matched the description of the snallygaster, the mix of bird and reptile features, the metallic parts, the tentacles. My wife was fascinated by it, and the further away we got, the more she researched it. The snallygaster had been a part of Appalachian folklore for centuries, with reports of sightings peaking in the early 1900s. People claimed it made a loud, metallic screeching sound, and it was said to prey on livestock and even humans. Most accounts described it as having leathery wings with a wingspan of up to 30 feet. Some even claimed it had a single eye in the center of its forehead. What bothered me the most, though, was the consistency of our 2 sightings, years apart. Both times the creature had the same features, the same screeching sound, and both times it seemed to be searching for something. I don't know if what we encountered was the legendary snallygaster or some undiscovered species, but it doesn't fit any known animal I've ever heard of. And the strangest thing, people in the area still report sightings from time to time. Story 3. Theo, I grew up in a small house nestled in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky. Most of my childhood memories are normal, playing in the yard, riding my bike down dirt roads, catching crowads in the creek behind our property. But there are some memories that still make my skin crawl, even if it's been about 20 years. My parents went through a rough patch when I was around 5 years old. I had no idea what was happening, only that they argued a lot, sometimes late into the night. My dad worked at a dealership in the nearby town, not as a salesman either, so he had long hours and mandatory overtime that kept him away from home often. Mum worked part-time at the Dollar General in town and was always stressing about money. They'd fight over bills about Dad's hours, about who was supposed to pick me up from kindergarten. Their voices would echo through our small house, impossible to miss, even with my door closed and my pillow over my head. I remember lying in bed, worried they might get divorced like my friend Tommy's parents had. Tommy had to move to an apartment with his mum and only ever saw his dad on weekends. The thought of that happening to me was terrifying. I'd cry myself to sleep most nights, my stomach in knots, wondering if tomorrow would be the day one of them would leave for good. One night, I think it was fall, because I remember the sound of leaves scraping against the window. I woke up to someone tapping on my shoulder. It wasn't a gentle tap to wake me up, rather like an impatient poke that startled me out of my sleep. When I opened up my eyes, I saw a figure standing beside my bed that looked like my mom. It was dark, so I couldn't see her face clearly, but I recognized her shape and her hair. She was wearing what looked like her nightgown, a long white thing that reached her ankles. She didn't say anything, but she curled her finger in a come here gesture. I was confused, but I got out of bed like she wanted. My room was cold, much colder than it should have been with the heating on. The figure walked over to my window, which was already open about halfway now. That struck me as odd even then, because I never opened my windows. They were old wooden sash windows with peeling paint, nearly impossible for a kid my age to open or close without help. The wood would swell in the damp weather, making them stick, and the counterweights inside. The frame were broken, so you had to hold them up with a stick if you wanted them to stay open. The figure gestured toward the open window, beckoning me to follow. I remember looking around my room, wondering if I was still asleep and dreaming. My Batman nightlight was still on, casting just enough light to see shapes, but not details. My digital clocker at 4:00 a.m. When I looked back at the window, she was already outside, her upper body visible as she leaned in, still motioning for me to follow her. I approached the window and started to climb out. The sill was at chest height for me back then, so I had to really hoist myself up. I remember the rough wood against my palms, the cold night air hitting my face, and the strange silence outside, and that's the last thing I remember until the next morning. I woke up sometime later to my parents yelling. I was lying on the ground outside, right below my bedroom window, curled up in the mulch of my mom's flower bed. The fall wasn't far. Our house was a single story, but I was confused and disoriented. I was freezing cold too, my pajamas damp with morning dew, and there were small scratches on my arms and face from the holly bush I'd apparently landed in. When my parents found me, I asked my mum why she wanted me to sleep outside last night. The look on her face is something I'll never forget, pure confusion with traces of fear. The poor woman had no idea what I was talking about. My dad picked me up and carried me inside while Mum checked me for injuries. They kept asking how I got outside, if I'd climbed out the window myself, if I'd been sleepwalking. I just told them Mum came to my room and told me to follow her out the window. My parents were visibly shaken. They looked at each other. Then my mum said, "Honey, I was in bed all night. I never came into your room." My dad had a look at my window. It was still open, but no signs of damage or forced entry. For weeks afterward, they checked my window every night to make sure it was locked, and eventually my dad nailed it shut. As I got older, I mostly forgot about that incident. My parents worked through their problems when I was around 7. Dad got a better job with better hours, and they started to do marriage counseling at the church. By the time I was 12 years old, they seemed happier than ever. They went on regular date nights every Friday, leaving me with my older cousin Melissa as a babysitter. When they weren't on dates, they were either working or busy around the house. Dad with yard work, Mum with cleaning and cooking. At 12, I was going through my own issues. Middle school was tough. I was smaller for my age and I was getting picked on. I didn't have many friends, and the ones I did have were starting to get into sports and girls, neither of which interested me yet. I spent most of my time playing video games or reading comic books in my room. I started to feel neglected, though I didn't have the emotional vocabulary to describe it that way back then. I simply knew that whenever I tried to talk to my parents about school or asked them to play a game with me, they seemed distracted. "Not now, honey," or "Can it wait until after dinner?" were phrases I heard daily. I felt very lonely and left out of their lives. So one Friday in late September, when I knew they had plans to go out that evening, I decided to run away. Not for real, just for a day, to make them worry and maybe pay more attention to me. I wasn't really thinking through the consequences or how stupid and dangerous it would be. In my 12-year-old mind, it was the master plan. The plan was to stay up all night so I could sneak out at sunrise before they woke up. I would have set an alarm, but it was loud and didn't work half the time. I packed up some snacks in my backpack, a sleeve of saltine crackers and a couple of granola bars and a bottle of water. I also grabbed my Game Boy Advance, a flashlight, my favorite comic book, and a light jacket in case it got cold. I didn't take much else. I was planning to come home the next day after all, and I was a kid who didn't understand what I was doing. Around 5:30 and when the sky was just starting to lighten, I snuck out the back door and headed for the woods behind our property. The morning was cool and misty, still dark enough that I needed my flashlight to see the path. Within moments, dew had soaked through my sneakers, so that sucked. I walked about a half-mile in to a spot where I could still see our house if I positioned myself right. There was this big oak tree there that I liked to climb sometimes, and I settled myself underneath it. I spent the morning playing Pokemon on my Game Boy, eating crackers, and feeling pretty pleased with myself, imagining how worried my parents were going to be and how they were going to apologize over and over for not spending enough time with me. As the morning went on, I got bored. I tried climbing the tree but couldn't get very high. I threw rocks at other trees, trying to improve my aim. I made up stories in my head about being a survivalist living off the land. Around what I guessed was about 11 o'clock a.m., I ate one of my granola bars. Rationing my food since I didn't know how long I'd be out there again, the plan was to stay out there for a full day, but the longer I was out, the more I kind of just wanted to go home. Around noon, I heard footsteps coming from deeper in the woods, not from the direction of my house. The steps sounded human, not like an animal. I thought it might be my parents searching for me, so I called out, "Mom!" The footsteps stopped immediately. Complete silence followed. The sudden stillness was unnerving, like I was being watched by everything in the forest. After that, I got a bit restless. I started to walk around a bit, still staying in the general area, but changing positions a few times. I found a small stream and followed it for a while, then circled back to my tree. Eventually, I sat down again, this time facing away from the house and deeper into the forest. About 2 hours later, my Game Boy batteries died in the middle of a battle. Disappointed, I looked up, and when I did, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Standing at the edge of the trees about 20 feet away from me was a figure that looked like my mum, or at least had her general shape and build. She was wearing what looked like the blue sweater my mum had put on that morning, but she was positioned in a way that her face was covered in shadows, and something about her stance felt wrong. Her arms hung a bit too low, and she was standing too still. I called out again, "Mom!" The figure nodded slowly and beckoned me with her hand, a similar come here gesture from years before. There was something about it, though. The movement was twitchy in a way. I got up and started to walk towards her, already feeling foolish about my plan to run away. I started to apologize, explaining that I was going to come back home, that I just wanted them to notice me more. I rambled on and on about how they never had time for me anymore, how they were always busy with each other or with work. The figure didn't respond, just turned and started to walk deeper into the woods, occasionally looking back and gesturing for me to follow. I followed, but something felt wrong. She was moving too quick, staying just far enough ahead that I couldn't get a good look at her. She never spoke, never responded to my apologies or questions, and she was leading me away from home into a part of the woods that I didn't recognize. The trees were thicker here, older, with more underbrush that scratched up my legs through my jeans. "Why are you going so fast? Where are we going?" I called out, breaking into a jog to keep up with her. The figure didn't slow or respond, just kept the same pace, always just out of reach. The rational part of my brain started to send warning signals. Why would my mum ignore me? Why would she lead me deeper into the woods instead of just taking me home? But I kept following anyway, partly out of curiosity, and partly because I didn't want to admit to myself that something was wrong. I started running, trying my hardest to catch up. I was focused entirely on the figure ahead of me. That's why I didn't see the drop-off until it was too late. The ground suddenly disappeared beneath my feet. I hadn't been watching where I was going, and I'd run straight over the edge of a steep ravine. I tumbled down, hitting rocks and branches before landing hard at the bottom. For a few terrifying seconds, I couldn't breathe. My chest felt compressed, like someone was sitting on it. When my lungs finally started to work again, I gasped in air and immediately started to cough. My whole body ached. I checked myself for broken bones, moving each limb carefully. By some miracle, I was just badly scratched and bruised, with a large gash on my arm that was bleeding, but not too deeply. If I'd fallen a little differently, I could have broken my neck. I could have died. Disoriented and scared, I looked around. The ravine was about 15 feet deep, with steep sides of loose dirt and rock. At the bottom was a dry creek bed filled with stones and debris. I didn't recognize anything around me. I had never been this far into the woods before. I tried climbing back up the side I'd fallen down, but it was too steep, and the dirt kept giving way under my feet. My shoes kept slipping on loose rocks, and I fell back down twice, scraping my hands and knees pretty bad. After about 15 minutes of failed attempts, I started to call for my mum and dad, hoping they were out there somewhere looking for me. I shouted until my throat hurt, then sat in silence for half an hour. I waited, listening and hoping for a response. Nothing came back but the occasional bird call or rustle of wind through the trees. I was crying then. I walked to the other side of the ravine where the slope looked less steep, and I was able to climb out by grabbing onto tree roots and pulling myself up. My plan was to circle around to where the ravine was shallower on both sides, thinking I could find my way back home from there easily, but I quickly realized I was completely lost. Every direction looked the same, just trees and more trees with no landmarks I recognized. I tried to find the sun to get my bearings, but the forest canopy was too thick. I had no idea which way was north, which way was south, let alone which way led back to my house. I picked a direction and started to walk, hoping to find a trail or a road, anything. I spent hours wandering, screaming for help until my voice was gone. My feet hurt, my scratches stung, and I was getting increasingly desperate. The sun was setting, filtering through the trees in orange streaks, and panic really set in. I'd been in these woods at dusk before, but never this far, never alone. When night fell completely, the darkness was absolute. No streetlights, no house lights. I couldn't even see the moon through the trees. I tried using my flashlight, but the batteries were weak and it died after about 20 minutes. Now I was in complete darkness, stumbling around, tripping over roots and rocks. Eventually I was exhausted and terrified, so I sat down against a tree trunk and cried myself to sleep. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up and it was still dark. At first I was disoriented still. I felt like I was sitting in someone's lap. My back was against something that wasn't the tree that I'd fallen asleep against. There was a body beneath me, ice cold, someone's legs like they'd been sitting in a freezer. Though something sharp was moving across my cheek like a nail or claw, gently scraping my skin. The touch was almost tender, but it made my skin crawl. I looked up and saw what appeared to be my mother's silhouette. Her familiar hair framing her face, and relief flooded through me, and I whispered, "Mom." As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw that what I was looking at was not my mother at all. The face had a mouth, a wide, stretched smile with no lips, but where the eyes, nose, and eyebrows should have been, there was nothing but smooth and pale skin stretched over her face. The smile widened as I looked at it. I screamed and scrambled away, my heart pounding so hard it could have burst. When I looked back, the figure was gone. I pressed my back against a real tree, trying to control my breathing, straining my eyes to see in the dark, terrified that thing would return. That's when I heard my father's voice in the distance calling my name. At first I thought it might not be real, but the voice was unmistakably his, deep and slightly hoarse. I'd know that voice from anywhere. I screamed back for him, my voice breaking. He yelled back to me to stay where I was and to just keep calling out. So I did just that, sobbing between shouts. 5 minutes later, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, I saw my parents running towards me, along with 2 police officers and what looked like search and rescue volunteers. My mother ran to me and wrapped me in her arms, crying as hard as I was, while my dad kept saying, thank God," over and over. One of the officers draped a blanket around my shoulders. I was shivering uncontrollably from cold and fear. I apologized repeatedly, telling them I had only meant to run away for a day, not to get lost like this. Through my tears, I mentioned the lady who had made me follow her and gotten me lost. They looked confused, but didn't press me for details. Then my dad carried me back through the woods. It took almost an hour to reach our house, which showed how far I'd wandered. At home, paramedics checked me out, cleaning and bandaging my cuts, making sure I didn't have any infections. The police asked me some questions about why I had run away, but they were gentle about it. I overheard one of them telling my parents they were lucky a kid my age lost in those woods overnight. Things could have ended much worse. Later that night, after the police left and I'd been cleaned up and fed, my parents sat on the edge of the bed and asked me about the lady I'd mentioned. I told them about how I thought it was Mum calling me into the woods, about following her to the ravine, about waking up in the lap of something that wasn't my mum and wasn't human. I described that faceless woman. I also told them about the night when I was 5, how it felt similar, and how I now believed the same thing had tried to lure me out the window. I could tell from their expressions they weren't sure whether to believe me, but they were clearly disturbed. Dad's face had gone a bit paler, and Mum kept making the sign of the cross, something she only did when she was truly scared. They made me promise never to go into the woods alone again, and told me that if I ever felt upset or neglected, I should just talk to them directly instead of running away. I kept that promise. I never went back into those woods by myself, and we moved away from that house a year later when Dad got a job in another state. Before we left, I overheard Dad talking to a neighbor about other kids who had gone missing in those mountains over the years. Some were found, some weren't. To this day, I don't know what that thing was. Why did it look like my mom? Why did it want me to go with her? I'm completely convinced it wanted to hurt me. It tried to lead me into the woods out the window, and for some reason that didn't work, so it waited for another opportunity when I was older. If you take anything away from this story, take 2 things actually. 1, don't be a silly goose kid, and run away from your parents, talk with them, and 2, don't follow strange entities into the woods of Appalachia. Story 4. Growing up in my family, bonfires were a cherished part of our gatherings. My Uncle Lester, who I'll mention by name for this story, was especially fond of these fires. He would come over at least once a month, usually when the weather was nice. bringing a cooler full of Budweiser and plenty of wood to create a fire that would burn well into the night. These get-togethers were more than just a regular event. They were almost like a tradition. There would usually be my parents, Uncle Lester, occasionally his on-again, off-again girlfriend Sherry, and a rotating cast of neighbours or co-workers that my dad would invite along. The scene was often set with people sitting in lawn chairs, drinks in hand, gathered around the fire, while Uncle Lester played his old, beat-up acoustic guitar. He wasn't the greatest guitarist, but after everyone had a few beers, nobody seemed to mind much, and the night would stretch on with the crackling fire and music. As a kid, I was rarely allowed to stay out there for the whole thing. My mum would let me hang around until about 9 p.m. I'd roast marshmallows and listen to the grown-ups talk. But then it was bedtime, and no matter how much I protested, I was always sent to bed. Mum often explained that the conversation was for adults, and I wasn't supposed to be around for the swearing or for the kinds of stories I probably shouldn't hear at my age. I didn't mind too much, though. There was a certain kind of magic to those bonfire nights, even from the inside looking out. There was one particular night that stuck in my memory more than the others. I must have been around 8 years old at the time. It was summer, and I had once again been sent to bed while the bonfire was still burning brightly. My bedroom window faced the backyard, and even though I was supposed to be asleep, I could still hear the sounds of the fire crackling, the occasional laugh, and the voices of my parents and Uncle Lester as they talked and drank. I remember lying there, wide awake, just listening to them for what seemed like hours. Eventually, the voices of the adults began to fade as people started heading home or calling it a night, but I could still hear my dad and Uncle Lester out there, their voices low as they kept drinking by the fire. I was almost asleep when something else broke through the peacefulness. Yelling. It wasn't angry shouting, but it sounded alarmed, like someone was in a panic. I heard running around the yard, a sudden burst of activity, followed by the sound of the back door slamming open and then shut. There was a moment of silence, and then I heard both my dad and Uncle Lester burst into uncontrollable laughter. It was that kind of laughing where you can barely catch your breath. I rolled my eyes and went back to sleep, thinking they were being silly. It became just one of those strange, almost surreal childhood memories that would occasionally resurface but fade away with time. Fast forward to the present day, I'm now 35 years old, married with kids of my own. We were having Uncle Lester over for dinner one evening, and the kids had insisted on watching Sonic the Hedgehog for movie night. Lester, now grey-haired and slower than he used to be, still came around to see the kids every chance he could. His mischievous grin hadn't gone anywhere, though, and he was sprawled out on the couch with a beer in hand, just like old times. About halfway through the movie, something triggered that old memory from my childhood. I'm not sure what brought it up, but I couldn't help myself. I turned to Uncle Lester and said, "Hey, remember those bonfires you used to have at my parents' place?" He took a sip of his beer and nodded. "Those were good times," he replied with a grin. I went on, "I remember one night when I was a kid. I remember hearing you and Dad running inside the house like something was chasing you. I heard you laughing, but you also sounded a little creeped out." Uncle Lester's eyebrows shot up, his face lighting up with recognition. Then a slow, nostalgic smile spread across his face. "Holy crap. You remember that?" he asked, more to himself than to me. I looked over at the kids, who were thankfully absorbed in the movie, then said, "Yeah, I remember it. What happened that night? I've always wondered." "Whoa." Lester leaned back, his eyes sparkling with that mischievous glint I remembered from my childhood. "Well, you won't believe it, but here's what happened." He took another drink from his beer and then continued. "Your dad and I were the last ones out there, just drinking too many beers and telling work stories. The fire was burning low, and we were pretty buzzed, just hanging out. Then, out of nowhere, believe it or not, it's your choice to believe me or not, this little man came running out of the woods. I stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or to take him seriously. A little man? Yep, not a kid. A man, but tiny, maybe 2.5 feet tall. He had on a pointed green hat and a long nose. His ears were all weird too, with these big lobes stretched out, kind of like those people who put gauges in their ears. I couldn't help but laugh. "You're pulling my leg, right?" Lester shook his head, holding up his hand like he was taking an oath. "Swear to God. Ask your dad the next time you see him. That little guy chased us around the fire pit. We were scared out of our minds, but we were also laughing because it was just so dang weird. Finally, we made a break for the house and locked the door behind us." I raised an eyebrow. "What did you think it was?" Lester shrugged. "Look, there's nobody around here that small. Not even the kids. And this wasn't no kid. Your dad and I talked it over afterward, and we thought maybe we imagined it, or maybe it was just some small animal, but we both described the same thing exactly. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Maybe they had both had too many drinks, but Uncle Lester was dead serious. He believed it happened, and he hadn't seen anything like it before, or since. The next morning, feeling hungover, they'd gone out to look around. They couldn't find any trace of the little man. No footprints, no nothing. It seemed impossible, but they were both convinced it was real, despite there being no evidence to support it. I was quiet for a moment, processing what he'd just told me. The kids cheered at something on the TV, breaking the moment, and Lester winked at me, turning back to the movie. Oh boy, got to say, those were some of the best stories I've gotten in a while. He chuckled to himself, clearly enjoying the memory. Well done to the folks who sent those in. That Lady of the Woods story is going to haunt my nightmares tonight. Reminds me of that movie Mama. Go watch it if you like being scared to sleep. And with that, Lester settled back into his seat, the same mischievous grin returning to his face as the kids continued to watch the movie. The mystery of that strange little man from the woods would never really be solved, but it would always be a part of our family's lore, the story that no one could quite explain. Story 5. It was one of those perfect summer evenings, the kind where the air was warm but not too hot, and the scent of pine and earth lingered in the breeze. My family lived in a small house on the outskirts of a forested area, far enough from the city to feel like we were in our own little world, but close enough that the convenience of town wasn't too far away. Our house had a big backyard that led straight into the woods, the perfect place for bonfires and long, lazy nights. We often hosted gatherings during the warmer months, with friends, family, and sometimes just neighbors we didn't know too well, but somehow ended up being invited anyway. One of the most enthusiastic participants in our bonfire nights was my Uncle Ray. He was an odd one, always the life of the party, but also a bit of a mystery. Uncle Ray wasn't the type to make small talk. He would show up with a cooler of beer, sometimes a bottle of whiskey, and usually a few fish stories about his time working out on the docks. His laugh was infectious, and he had an ability to make you feel like everything in the world was just a little bit more fun when he was around. We loved him, even if sometimes his stories could get a little out there. On one particular night, I was about 9 years old. It was the middle of summer, and my parents had invited some friends over. The fire was blazing. The air smelled like roasted marshmallows, and the firelight flickered on the faces of everyone gathered around it. Uncle Ray had been playing his old, worn guitar, but it was getting late. He was a few beers in, and his strumming was getting sloppier by the minute. As usual, the adults were laughing, telling stories, and reminiscing about things they probably shouldn't have been talking about in front of kids. I remember I was sitting a little farther away, trying to roast marshmallows while half listening to the conversation. It wasn't the most exciting thing to be a kid around adults when they were drinking and talking about things you didn't understand, but every now and then, I'd catch something that piqued my interest. On this particular night, I could hear my dad and Uncle Ray discussing something strange that had happened a few years ago, but the conversation was so casual that I didn't think much of it at the time. As the night wore on, my mom told me it was bedtime. I was reluctant as always, but I knew I had no choice. My parents didn't let me stay up for the entire bonfire, so I trudged off to my room, my window still open so I could hear the party going on outside. The flickering glow of the fire shone through the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. I could hear the low murmur of the adults' voices and the occasional burst of laughter. It was about 10:30 when I heard something that didn't belong. It was faint at first, a rustling in the trees. Then it became louder, closer. At first, I thought it was just one of the adults stumbling around after a few too many drinks, but as I listened more closely, I could hear something else. Footsteps. Heavy, but not human footsteps. There was a sound of something or someone moving quickly through the brush, moving in and out of the firelight. I crept to the window and peered out, my heart racing. The fire had burned low, and the yard was shrouded in shadow. I could just make out the figures of my dad and Uncle Ray standing by the fire pit, talking quietly. I couldn't make out their words, but I could tell something was off. They were looking into the woods, their heads swiveling back and forth, scanning the trees. Then I saw it. A shadow flitted across the yard, darting from one tree to the next. It was too small to be a person, but too big to be an animal. It was quick, too quick. And then I saw it more clearly, a small figure barely 3 feet tall, with a hunched back and a strange cloak that blended in with the dark of the night. It had wide, glowing eyes that reflected the firelight in a way that made my skin crawl. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Was I imagining things? I watched as the little figure disappeared into the shadows again, reappearing closer to the fire. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence in a way that made my skin prickle. Suddenly, Uncle Ray and my dad both stiffened, their conversation halting. They looked at each other, their eyes wide with a mix of confusion and fear. And then the little figure was gone, disappeared into the darkness, like it had never been there. A few moments later, I heard the back door slam open and shut, followed by the sound of footsteps hurrying across the house. My dad and Uncle Ray came rushing inside, their faces pale. The mood outside had shifted instantly from light-hearted fun to something tense. The other adults didn't seem to notice right away, but there was an air of unease between my dad and Uncle Ray. They didn't speak much for the rest of the night. I tried to act like I hadn't seen anything, but the memory of that strange figure stuck with me. The next morning, when I asked my dad about it, he just shrugged it off. Probably just some weird animal, he said, but there was something in his eyes that told me he wasn't so sure. Uncle Ray, on the other hand, seemed downright uncomfortable when I brought it up. It wasn't until years later, when I was in my late teens, that I found out the full story. Uncle Ray had finally decided to tell me what had really happened that night, but only after a few beers to loosen his tongue. He had always been a bit of a joker, so at first I wasn't sure if I should believe him, but the look in his eyes said otherwise. "Kid, you don't know the half of it," he said, leaning in closer like he was about to share some big secret. "That little guy you saw, he wasn't alone. There were others." I looked at him, unsure of where he was going with this. "The first time I saw one of those things," Uncle Ray continued, "it was a few years back, just like the night you remember. I was out there with your dad. We'd been drinking too much and we were talking, you know, the usual, but something felt off. We heard a rustling in the trees just like you did, and then, out of nowhere, a figure, exactly like the one you saw, came out from the woods. It didn't say anything, just stared at us with those glowing eyes. It was small, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. I swear, it wasn't human." "Whoa." I listened in silence as he went on, telling me about how the little creature had been joined by others. Some had emerged from the shadows, all wearing the same dark cloaks and glowing eyes. They didn't approach the fire. Instead, they just watched from the trees, their presence filling the air with a sense of dread. "They didn't hurt us," Uncle Ray said, "but I could tell they didn't want us there. Your dad and I decided to pack up and head inside, and that's when things got real weird. One of them followed us right up to the back door, just standing there in the yard, staring at us. We didn't dare open that door again until morning, and when we did, there was no sign of them, no footprints, no trace of anything." I could feel the weight of his words as he spoke, and a chill ran down my spine. "So, what were they?" I asked. Uncle Ray shrugged, a half-hearted grin appearing on his face. "I don't know, but I'll tell you one thing. I haven't set foot in those woods at night since, and I won't." The memory of that strange night stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind every time I thought of the woods behind our house. I never spoke of it to anyone else, but every time we had a bonfire, I couldn't help but glance nervously toward the trees, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. Years have passed, and we've moved away from that house, but I'll never forget the feeling of those eyes on me, or the strange figures lurking just beyond the firelight. There's something out there in the woods. I'm not sure what it is, but I know one thing for certain. I don't ever want to find out. Story 6. The woods behind my childhood home had always been a place of mystery. They were vast, thick with trees, and overgrown with vines and brush that made them feel like a labyrinth. As kids, my friends and I would spend hours exploring, daring each other to venture deeper into the forest, but there was always something about the woods that felt off. It wasn't the kind of place that made you feel comfortable or safe, but rather one that tugged at the back of your mind, leaving you with the sensation that you were being watched. My parents didn't think much of it, though. They grew up in a small town and were used to the solitude the woods offered. My mum used to tell me stories about how her family would go on hikes and picnics in those same woods when she was young, but even she admitted there were things in those woods that didn't make sense. Sometimes she'd mention hearing strange noises late at night, whispers that seemed to drift from the trees, voices that sounded like they belonged to people, but no one was ever there. I was about 12 when it happened. I had been walking with my dog, Daisy, down a well-trodden path that led through the woods. Daisy was a big, lovable golden retriever who was the most loyal companion you could ask for, but she had a knack for sensing things before anyone else could. She'd often stop dead in her tracks, her ears perked, sniffing the air like she could smell something no one else could. I'd just laugh and give her a gentle tug on the leash, trying to pull her along, but that day, something felt different. We had wandered deeper into the forest than I had ever been before. The path was barely visible now, swallowed by the underbrush and trees that seemed to close in around us. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground, and the temperature had dropped slightly. It was that time of evening where the forest seemed to change, becoming quieter, more still, as if it was holding its breath. I glanced over at Daisy, who was standing stock still in the middle of the path, her nose twitching in the air. Her body was tense, and her tail was rigid, not wagging as usual. I followed her gaze, but I couldn't see anything at first. It was then that I heard it. The faintest rustle of leaves, a sound so subtle that if I hadn't been paying close attention, I would have missed it. But there it was again, a soft scuffling noise coming from just beyond the trees. My heart started to race. "Come on, Daisy," I whispered, trying to coax her forward, but she didn't budge. She was staring intently at a spot in the woods, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. Then the air seemed to shift, and everything went unnervingly quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, no wind, just silence. I knew I should have turned around and headed back, but curiosity got the better of me. I took a hesitant step forward, and that's when I saw it. At first it was just a shadow, a small, hunched shape, barely visible between the trees. I thought it might be an animal, but then it moved, and I saw it more clearly. It was small, no more than 3 feet tall, with a thick cloak of dark brown and green that blended seamlessly with the surroundings. The figure was crouched low to the ground, its hands splayed out on the earth as though it was listening, waiting for something. I froze, my blood running cold. Daisy growled low in her throat, the fur on the back of her neck standing up. The figure turned its head slowly, as if it sensed us watching. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was obscured by a large, wide-brimmed hat that covered most of its features, but its eyes were unmistakable, glowing faintly in the dim light, an eerie yellow that seemed to burn with an unnatural intensity. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of us moved. The creature's gaze locked with mine, and a shiver ran down my spine. There was something about its presence that made my skin crawl, something unsettling in the way it seemed to study me, almost as if it were weighing my very soul. Then, without warning, the creature darted off into the trees with a speed that didn't seem possible for something so small. It disappeared into the darkness, leaving nothing but the rustling of leaves in its wake. I stood there, frozen in shock, unable to move for what felt like an eternity. Daisy, too, seemed paralyzed by fear, her tail tucked between her legs. Finally, I snapped out of my trance and, without a second thought, grabbed Daisy by the collar and started running back down the path. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed through the underbrush, desperate to get out of the woods. When I finally emerged into the clearing near our house, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. Daisy immediately curled up beside me, her body still tense, her ears twitching as if she was listening for something. I looked back at the woods, but I couldn't see anything. It was as if the forest had returned to normal, the night air calm and still. But I knew what I had seen. I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't shake the image of that strange creature from my mind, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw its glowing yellow eyes staring back at me. I tried to tell my parents about what happened, but they didn't believe me. "You probably just saw a shadow or a trick of the light," my dad said, dismissing my story with a laugh. But I knew what I had seen. I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to go back into the woods. I avoided them whenever I could, and I never went out past the edge of the yard again. But every now and then, when the wind was just right, I would hear strange sounds coming from the trees, soft rustlings like something or someone moving through the branches. And once, I thought I saw a small figure watching me from the edge of the woods, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Years later, I moved away from that house, and I thought I'd left the strange happenings behind. But every time I passed by a forest, especially one that's dense and full of shadows. I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me from the depths of the trees. The truth is, I don't know what I saw that night, or if it was real at all. But whatever it wasn't something that belonged in our world. And I'll never forget the way it looked at me, its eyes burning with an ancient knowledge, as if it knew something about the woods that I could never understand. Maybe some things are meant to stay in the darkness, buried deep within the forest, never to be uncovered. I only hope I never cross paths with it again.